Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to the seminar. We'll just wait a minute or two to allow everybody to come in, and then we get officially started. Thanks so much for joining us today. We'll just wait a minute or two. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We'll get started in a minute, just allowing for some other participants to join. Thanks. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening again. Welcome for our third session of the GCF Watch International Webinar Series, which is a joint collaboration of a number of organizations with AIDA, the Asian Pacific Movement for Debt and Development, both ends, CIEL, GCF Watch, the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, German Watch, the Heinrich Böll Foundation, the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, and WIDO. My name is Liane Schalatek. I'm with the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Washington, DC, and a longtime GCF civil society observer, as are the other speakers that will be joining us today for this great panel and discussion, where we are looking at important topics around the Green Climate Fund. This is some of the topics that some of you who joined in previous sessions under this webinar series indicated you would like to hear more information. And some of the issues that we are covering today are related to what happened at the last board meeting, B33, the replenishment process, access to GCF finance, as well as the engagement with national designated authorities. I wanted to let everybody know that this webinar is recorded. We also have simultaneous interpretation available in several languages, English, obviously, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. For this, please click on the globe sign for the interpretation and select your language channel. We are again really delighted to have a great set of speakers today, although we have some changes from the speakers indicated in the list. So Berta Agueda from German Watch will not be able to join us today. Instead, we will hear from Erika Lennon from CIEL. And we also, unfortunately, won't have Brenna Bomsam from the Third World Network, but I will try to cover some of the issues related to the GCF resources replenishment and linkage to international climate finance myself. And so we are practicing what is really important in the engagement with the Green Climate Fund, particularly for observers, which is adaptive management and in trying to maximize engagement and ensure that the advocacy that civil society wants to bring forward is as successful as possible. So again, the speakers that we have today have all been actively engaging with the GCF as CSO observers for a number of years. They are well versed in engaging with the fund, and we are really very much looking forward to hearing from them today. as part of our discussions here. We want to start out, and I think it's very important in order to bring us up to date of what is going on at the moment with the GCF before we are delving in some specific topics, in taking a look back at what happened at the latest GCF board meeting, B33, the 33rd board meeting, which was taking place in mid-July, so 2 weeks ago, and which took a number of really important decisions. And I want to introduce Erica Lennon, who is a senior attorney from CIEL, the Center for International Environmental Law. She is also the current CSO active observer for developed countries, as such represents civil society on the board and makes interventions on behalf of civil society in the board, as part, obviously, of the coordinated engagement of civil society and the GCF Observer Network of civil society organizations, indigenous peoples, and local communities. So Erica, welcome. Thanks so much, especially in Erica's case. A lot of her engagement with the Green Climate Fund has been via Zoom for really ungodly times, as she is located in California and thus needs to get up really early or stay up really late to engage with the Green Climate Fund, again, showcasing her dedication and the dedication of the CSO network, the Observer Network more broadly, on working actively and constructively on and with the Green Climate Fund. So Erica, please go ahead, and we are looking forward to hearing from you some of the key issues that were discussed at B33 and also with a slight outlook of what is ahead. So please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Liana, and thanks to all of the organizers who've done a lot to put together today's session, as well as all of the other ones in the GCF Watch series. And thanks to all of you for coming, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. So as Liana mentioned, I'm going to talk and give some updates from B33, which took place a couple weeks ago in Korea in person. This was the second in-person meeting that the GCF has held since March of 2020, since the pandemic started, and is the first one that it's held that was really open to some of the actors that are typically at a board meeting, including more of people from our network of observers, and including, the accredited entities and some of the people from nationally designated authorities in countries and others, and not just to the first one that was in person. B32 was really only open to the board and to very limited observers, including the active observers from civil society as well as from the private sector. So this was really the second in-person one, which was good. And I would say that I think both of these meetings have demonstrated what can happen, or the ability of the GCF board, and what they can do when they are back in person, and to have both more time during a day, because the meetings are not taking place across so many time zones, and just the benefits of being in person. So I'm going to talk about a few of the things that happened there, and maybe I'll start with the things that are sort of typical of board meetings and that happen at most board meetings, which are that at this one, as is often the case, one of the main things that the board does is look at potential projects at the GCF and approves them for funding to get finance, which obviously is the main task of the GCF, is to provide climate finance to countries around the world who need it, and they do it through their accredited entities, as many of you who've joined us in the past know. So at this board meeting, the GCF approved 4 projects, which were all of the projects that were up for accreditation or up for approval at this board meeting. And so it includes the 4 projects were 2 by FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, who have brought forward projects, one in the Wime Basin on climate resilience, for a climate resilience initiative in Benin, and one on climate resilient fisheries in the Gambia. They also approved a e-mobility program for sustainable cities in Latin America and the Caribbean that was presented by the Inter-American Development Bank, as well as a project called the Climate Investor 2 project, which is really a fund of fund projects, which is a program that FMO has brought forward that provides sort of a big pool of funding that will then go to, these will be primarily, I believe, water projects in I think 19 countries around the world, and is the continuation of, or a second sort of version of a project that the GCF had already funded. This brings the GCF's, that was project 190. So if you include the GCF sort of traditional funding proposals, as well as what has been approved through the simplified approval process, the GCF has now approved over 200 projects. I will say the 4 projects, having only 4 projects at a board meeting has been what they've done for much of this year, partially due to, and this connects later to some of the discussions around replenishment, partly due to the low commitment authority the GCF currently has with the sort of money they have on hand to spend for projects, which at the moment is quite low. Given the schedules of how countries have their pledges coming in and how their contributions will come in, they expect this commitment authority to be higher and to, at the next board meeting, see quite a few more projects. I think they're anticipating more, closer to around 10 to 15, which is what we were seeing last year, I think, and the year before, had sort of started seeing this, 10 or 15 projects per meeting, both through the sort of traditional funding proposal route and the simplified approval process, until they sort of had to taper back a bit because of this low commitment authority, which is due to both, the amount of pledges that they get, the pledges from contributor countries, those pledges being actually followed through on, and the money actually going to the GCF, but also how the money is delivered and the way that it's delivered from the countries and sort of the schedules they deliver on. So that's the first thing. And the other thing the GCF does at almost all of their board meetings is look at accrediting entities. At this one, they didn't accredit any new entities. So accredited entities are how GCF projects are brought forward. And while they didn't accredit any new entities, they did reaccredit 3 entities, including the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Asian Development Bank, and UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, which also was upgraded to be able to do larger projects. And so those were sort of the typical things that happen at most GCF meetings, as well as, and then the sort of things that were more, that happen that aren't the sort of day-to-day of meetings, but are sort of that way, is that at each meeting they discuss, they discuss a number of information documents that the board is looking at about GCF operations. And then they also discuss a number of policies or or processes or things that they're doing to help them function better. And so I'm going to concentrate on a few of those things, or a few of the announcements and things that happened at this meeting that sort of only happen when they come up. So I'll talk about a few of those major developments. The first of which is not a policy, but is a major development at the GCF, which is that near the start of the meeting, the executive director, Yannick Glamarek, announced that when his term ends in March of 2023, he will not be seeking renewal, which means that the GCF is starting a process of looking for a new executive director. Yannick has now been with us for several years and has brought the GCF, has largely had to deal with bringing the GCF through this pandemic and figuring out how to work and how to run an organization through the pandemic, and is stepping down. So he announced that at this meeting, which is also important as we're looking forward, as we're starting the GCF replenishment process, as well as a process to update the GCF strategic plan. I'm going to go to replenishment last, I think. The other two of the major things that the GCF adopted at this board meeting or decided to was they adopted an approach on adaptation. And they also adopted a paper on steps on climate rationale. And those two go somewhat hand in hand. And so the GCF has been working on creating an approach and looking at how to better increase its adaptation finance. I think as many of you probably know, and as we've seen from many reports, adaptation finance lags behind if you're looking at whether there's a balance between mitigation and adaptation. And so the GCF has adopted a new approach to adaptation to try and fix that balance and to try and make sure there's more adaptation finance. And alongside that, it also adopted a paper on assessing and steps for assessing climate rationale. So one of the key things that the GCF looks at, and that it's the Secretariat looks at, and its independent technical advisory panel looks at, is how the project relates to climate change, or how it has climate rationale. And this has been a stumbling block and somewhat of an issue, particularly in projects that are sometimes seen as whether they are actually climate projects or whether they're more development projects, and if there's a difference there. And so the GCF, and this has come up in a number of projects, whether it's related to water or something else. And so the GCF had been working on a paper to sort of outline how you define climate rationale. And that was accepted at this meeting as well. They also talked about a number of other things, including, what we're going to say in reporting to the COP. They talked a lot about various financial related matters, including related to risk management and hedging that I'm not going to talk too much about, but about sort of the management of the GCF's funds. They talked about, but did not approve. They discussed an information document on approach to forest financing, which I think has been a key issue that many across our network have been paying attention to, and goes to some of what they're thinking, both for how they may continue what was a pilot program on results-based payment for RED projects, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, but also what is broader, and what else they could consider in the realm of forest finance. This paper was just an information document and they just discussed it, but it's important to note because it may be something that comes forward again. It may inform the next phase of RED and RED results-based payment, which they haven't done yet, but also give some insight into how they're looking at financing around forest and land issues in the GCF. And the other sort of two big things that were discussed were first, at an informal board day, they had a discussion that between the board members as well as participation from active observers around what they wanted to see from the update to the updated strategic plan. And so as the GCF is going to be entering its next replenishment phase, which I imagine will be called GCF 2, given that we are in GCF 1 right now, they're also updating their strategic plan to coincide with that period. And it has to be adopted before the end of next year and before sort of the pledging conference for the replenishment based on what they've decided. And so they had an informal day to allow for interaction to discuss a number of questions about the strategic plan, including, is the GCF, is it still fit for purpose? Is it going in the right direction? What is the GCF's comparative advantage compared to the other climate finance funds? And so this was sort of the first of those sessions. I will note that there is an ongoing process right now to submit comments to some of these questions. So on the GCF website, there's a website dedicated to getting these comments. We will be working as a network to develop together collectively some comments for this process, which are due next week. But you can also participate in this process as individual organizations and others. And for those who are on the GCF CSO listserv, we'll be sending an email out about that. But you can look at the GCF website as they're sort of taking steps forward on the strategic plan. So they spent a day on that before the board meeting started. And then the other major thing that I would say that happened at this meeting was they kicked off the replenishment process. And so at B33, they officially launched the replenishment process for GCF 2, which will take us from now through 2023 to fall of 2023, when they will have a pledging conference, and which countries will give their pledges and sort of say, this time we're going to commit X number of millions or billions of dollars to the Green Climate Fund, which is hugely important because, one, it allows the GCF to continue financing and to continue operating and to continue to finance important mitigation and adaptation projects. And as we've seen, and as I think Liana will talk about later in this webinar, but as we've seen over and over again, we do not have enough climate finance right now. The GCF is the largest, specific climate fund we have. And so this is sort of the next phase, and to allow them to continue their work going forward, they had to launch this replenishment process. And so now there will be a series. And so what it means is that there will be a series of meetings that's going forward, both probably virtual and in person over the next year, that will involve GCF board members. It will involve potential other contributors. And importantly, I will say, it will also involve the active observers. And unlike GCF 1, we were able this time to have them commit to saying that both of the active observers, so the two active observers representing civil society, so from both developed and developing countries, though we work, as Liana mentioned, collectively together as a network to give the views of civil society, indigenous peoples, and local communities, as well as the two private sector observers, which is important for the process so that we can make sure we are there and able to participate. So I think those are some of the major things that happened at B33. I will mention, because I can't remember whether we, talked about, I don't think we talked about it post B32, but taking sort of these steps, both on replenishment, but also on the two policies that were adopted, continues going to sort of filling what had largely been seen as policy gaps. So at B32, they approved an updated simplified approval process. They approved a private sector strategy, as well as, some guidelines for board committees, amongst other things. And as they and one of the things they discussed at B33 was actually that there are fewer policy gaps than is often seen, but a lot of it is about implementation of those policies. I will say there are still some remaining policy gaps. And so as we look forward to B34, and as we look forward to next year, so B34 will take place in October. We will, as I mentioned, we will likely see more projects. There will be a number of entities that will come up again for reaccreditation. And we will also probably see some more policies being discussed, including, importantly, one that had a document this board meeting, but that they didn't get to, which is the strategy on accreditation. So they had put forward a document that they took comments on, but ultimately didn't have time to discuss. So that is likely coming up, as well as, ongoing discussions continuing around replenishment, around the updated strategic plan. And as many of you know, we still have outstanding policy processes that are going forward related to the development of the GCF's own environmental and social safeguards. They're developing a number of sector guides that at some point will come to the board for their consideration, as well as other policy updates and processes that will start that haven't started yet. And so I think I will stop there because I have run out of time. And I think I've covered most things, but happy to answer questions. And so back to you, Liana.
Yeah, thank you very much, Erica. And indeed, you covered quite a bit, even though it's hard in the time slots that we have to cover everything. And thus, I would really encourage, and Florencia already sent a note to everybody in the audience, encourage colleagues in the audience to really bring forward their questions in writing, either by putting them in the Q&A section or also sharing them in the chat section, and Florencia will collect them and share them later. And again, as Erica has said, we are looking actually at a quite busy August for civil society participation, observer engagement with some of the ongoing processes that are going on, with submissions for the strategic plan, the update to the strategic plan, with the ongoing process for the development of environmental and social safeguards, with some of the sector guidances for which there is still input thought. And it's very important for us to be vocal as Observer Network in providing and commenting on some of the approaches, because obviously it's not just a matter of filling policy gaps in the sense of, making a check mark on policies or approaches that the board has dealt with, but it's crucially important to also ensure that they are going in the right directions. And maybe we can have some of the discussion later on. But for example, there have been concerns by the Observer Network with respect to the focus of the private sector approach, including the adaptation approach, what that means, for example, particularly for the engagement of local communities, of improving access and benefits for some of the most vulnerable population groups, indigenous peoples and local communities. And again, this is something where the continuous input and strong pushback at times of the Observer Network, including through collective submissions, is really crucially important. Thanks again, Erica, and hopefully we can pick up on some of those issues in the question and answers. I want to now come to Mirja Stolt from the Namibian Nature Foundation, because obviously some of the really important engagement of the GCF Watch overall, and the GCF Watch partners and the CSO observers, is actually engaging with some of the constituent partners within the GCF. This is obviously when it comes to project proposals, for example, engaging with accredited entities directly, but it's also crucially and very importantly to engage with the national designated authorities, the NDAs, which are the country liaison to the Green Climate Fund, which are responsible for quite a bit. And that goes from the development of country programs that a country might put forward, in which it lays out its investment priorities with the Green Climate Fund, to readiness and preparatory support proposals, to an NDA providing what is called a letter of no objection for project proposals. So it's very important for civil society and observer groups and recipient countries to actually actively not only know who your NDA is, but also to engage with them. And we want to share, or Mirja is going to share, the experience of her organization and the broader Namibia civil society with engaging with the Namibia NDA. So please, Mirja, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Liana. So as mentioned, my name is Mirja. I'm a senior project coordinator at the Namibian Nature Foundation. And I'll just share some of our experiences in working with our national designated authority, which has been quite a steep learning curve for us over the past years. Perhaps a little bit of background. Liana already mentioned some of these things, but the National Designated Authority are always government institutions, and they are the interface between each country and the Green Climate Fund. And they are meant to represent, coordinate, and protect the interests of their respective countries. And some of the responsibilities is, on the one hand side, they nominate direct access entities, so national entities for accreditation. They are supposed to coordinate national engagements and GCF processes that are going on in the country. Liana already mentioned the no objection letters that they have to write for individual projects, and most NDAs have specific procedure they use for these. They should ideally be engaged in the development of the funding proposals, mainly because they're responsible for ensuring that there's consistency between national priorities and national strategies and policies and Green Climate Fund funded projects. And they're also supposed to facilitate communication between national entities and the Green Climate Fund. Perhaps just a little bit of context on the NNF, just to understand sort of the rest of the presentation. We are a non-governmental organization, a non-for-profit organization that was established in 1987, working mostly on wildlife management aspects. We are a hybrid organization, so we're involved in both national level policy making as well as field-based in nature. So we have our headquarters and regional offices who are working very much at the ground. And then we work through thematic areas and programmatic areas. And currently our largest programmatic areas are forestry, agriculture, freshwater and marine ecosystems, combating wildlife crime, community-based natural resource management, and recently climate change. Perhaps a little bit of a baseline from our side, so where we are coming from. So our national designated authority is the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism, and more specifically a very small department, the Climate Change Department. So they are relatively small compared to the rest of the ministry. And before, sort of about 1.5 years ago, we had a very, very limited contact. We had no active engagement whatsoever. We were not consulted in the development of projects. We were not consulted in the development of nationally determined contributions that were revised in 2021. In fact, no civil society organization in Namibia was. And apart from being nominated to become an accredited entity in 2018, there hasn't been much that we have been doing in the climate change space. And we also didn't have a very clear climate change portfolio. And what shifted a lot for us was to be part of the Civil Society Readiness for the Green Climate Fund project. So we were approached by German Watch. They were looking for partners in Southern Africa, and Namibia has 8 GCF funded projects. And as a result, there was a considerable scope for civil society to be more engaged in this space. And some of the main tools that we've been using as part of the project to be more engaged with our NDA was, on the one hand side, to have national workshops. And we've used these to basically show our NDA what civil society is already actively doing in the space. How can they benefit from this kind of expertise? How can they benefit from a more collaborative approach? And just increase awareness around sort of some of the things that civil society can bring to the table. And these workshops ended up building quite strong relationships. We also invited our only direct access entity and then all international access entities that have projects in Namibia. And it ended up building really, really good ties. So we had quite a few of those. And sort of what emerged out of the national workshops was that we created a CSO platform on climate change, because one of the main concerns our NDA had was that civil society is very difficult to engage because they tend to be very scattered and that they never really know who to approach. So this kind of platform or organization in a platform really helps to have one contact point who can organize the other civil society organizations and also refer the NDA to who would be most appropriate for a specific thing they are trying to achieve. So we've actively offered to use this platform to have policy discussions, to discuss projects. And we also convened meetings on their behalf and took over a lot of the organization of these kind of aspects. And we've also been trying to look actively of how can we be more engaged and what spaces we can fill. So we did some consultations as part of developing our strategic plan, how we can support our NDA, what role do they see us playing, and it evolved into a very interesting discussion of where they would see civil society and what we would be in the best position to fill. And when we started, we were a bit worried that there would be very limited interest, and we felt very sidelined because we weren't in the past involved in a lot of these processes, and neither has any other civil society in Namibia. And it was actually having those kind of discussions was very useful to map out a way forward, to find common ground. And there was a lot of overlap and there was a lot of interest in working with civil society. So some of the main tips from our side, the first would be to try to understand how the NDA is working. There might be some that are very well staffed. There are others that are not very well staffed like ours. And it's important to understand the roles and responsibilities because it helps you to identify champions. And it helps you to identify people who are keen to work with civil society and that are able to drive these processes and make sure they lobby with the superiors and at the same time keep the rest informed. So that was something that proved very valuable for us. And we work very closely with about 2 to 3 people. And it has been working very well because they report quite well to their superiors as well. Then, of course, organizing regular meetings and just making sure that there's a very open dialogue. And a lot of this also, I think that's already what Erica said earlier, it's good to meet face to face. It's good to have these sort of informal discussions over coffee, even more so than having workshops. And part of that is also to just be supportive and responsive because our NDA at least often has requests and it's important to be engaged. For example, when they send through funding proposals and they want your technical expertise on it, or they join meetings with international accredited entities or the like, it's really important to be very responsive and be very engaged to build these relationships and to build the trust. And as mentioned, for us, this has been a very steep learning curve. We started with the first workshops last year in April, May. And some of the outcomes from our side, from being more engaged with our NDA, we're currently in the process of becoming a delivery partner for our National Adaptation Plan, which is a really good development and has been a very good experience because we work very closely with the ministry, who of course have to access readiness for us. And it's just a very good development to see a CSO actually doing the National Adaptation Plan, because it is a very local, adaptation is inherently very local. So I felt that was a very nice development and also very enriching for us. We're finally moving on with our nomination as accredited entity, and our NDA has actually requested readiness funding to help us meet the policy requirements that you have to meet for becoming an accredited entity. And we're also a lot more involved in sort of all types of processes that ranges from developing our new GCF country program. We were involved in revising our new NDCs after the last COP, and also are considered in the development of further policies and strategies. They've even invited us to climate finance training that they mainly did for private sector and ministry staff. So we were among the only civil society represented there, and we're trying to get more and more CSOs involved in the space. They regularly share funding opportunities and see us as a strategic partner in mobilizing more climate finance and mobilizing more resources. And we're also in a position where they actually share Green Climate Fund proposals or GEF proposals that they are working on with us before submitting them. So really in the development process, which is not something that happened before. We mostly saw it once they were approved. And they actually schedule a call with consultants so that we can advise them on how to better adapt it to sort of the Namibian conditions. And yes, that's all that happened lately. So that's all from my side. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat and I'll be happy to answer them later. And back to Liane.
Thanks so much, Mirja. And I want to point out, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your experience and also sharing the progress that you've seen through the engagement, which I really think is a good practice example of how that engagement can be and should be. Although I think we also have to be honest and say that it's not always the case. However, and I think it's very important to point that out, while there is no formal requirement for the NDA to engage with observers and civil society within the countries, there is guidance provided by the Secretariat to that effect, even again, if they are not giving a firm mandated obligation under what is considered, country ownership. And the limitations of country ownership being interpreted as not being able to tell countries specifically of who they should engage with or who they should not engage with. However, part of the observer network's engagement with the GCF, with NDAs, with accredited entities over the time, and one of the points that, for example, that we have also stressed very strongly within engagements on strategic programming, including for the updated strategic plan, and now for the revision of the updated strategic plan, is pointing out that country ownership does not mean government ownership, at least in our understanding, but has to mean the engagement and the active participation. And that includes, for example, issues like participatory monitoring of a broad set of actors, whether it's like in the case of the Namibia Nature Foundation, an organization that strives to become an accredited entity, or whether it might be an organization that could help with some concrete implementation aspects of projects as an executing entity, or whether it's just an organization that is critically monitoring, accessing, and providing constructive feedback, including criticism on what the NDA and its engagement with the GCF can do better. So again, I'm very glad to hear about that. I think it's also important as was pointed out, that very often in those type of engagements, there is strength in numbers, particularly through coordination of groups within the countries that helps both in dealing with expertise gaps that might be, with individual organizations, but obviously also helps in having a more coordinated, synchronized, and stronger advocacy towards the NDA. So thank you very much, Mirja, again, for that experience, which is a wonderful segue with best wishes for the Namibian Nature Foundation to become an accredited entity and to the kind of good projects that we really want to see in the Green Climate Funds, to get to our next speaker, who is Andrea Rodriguez from Fundación Avina. And Andrea is really a very good example of somebody who comes from civil society. Andrea has worked with AIDA before, and as that also represented civil society on the board for a time as a CSO alternate active observer, so knows basically some of the key CSO concerns before going to Fundación Avina, which is an accredited entity of the Green Climate Fund, and working on getting its first funding proposal through. And Andrea is going to talk to us about access to GCF finance through the accreditation process, which I assume, on drawing on the experience of Fundación Avina, might highlight both the opportunities but also the challenges that accredited entities face, particularly accredited entities that are focusing on engaging on local level grant-based finance with a focus on providing direct beneficiaries to communities on the ground. So please, Andrea, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Liane, for that introduction. And thank you very much, colleagues from AIDA and colleagues from everywhere, from being here in this webinar. Is a great pleasure to be back in this space, and particularly to be able to share Fundación Avina's experience, as Liana mentioned, our experience with the accreditation process with the GCF. So can I please see the next slide, please? So what I'm going to try to cover today very quickly is just go through some of the overall rules of the GCF accreditation process. I'm sure that many of you are very familiar with this process already, but it's just good to just remind ourselves of what are some of the important things that the GCF looks into when seeking for new partners. I would also share with you our experience in the accreditation process, but well, our overall experience with the GCF in this couple of years, and also provide some reflections, recommendations in terms of how can entities, especially civil society type of entities, can do if they want to engage with the GCF. Next one, please. First of all, I would like to, as I was saying, reflect on some of the overall rules to access GCF resources. As many of you know, that the GCF, the way to access resources for the GCF is through the accreditation process. And I mentioned here that we're speaking about developing countries, because although I do agree with what Liana said before, that when we talk about the concept of country ownership, it goes beyond governments. It's about the entire country and about the stakeholders that are part of that country. But it's true that within the rules of the game, are developing countries the ones that can access resources from the GCF through accredited entities for climate change projects and programs. And accreditation conditions varied according to a number of matters. So particularly they vary according to the capacity of the entity and the track record of that entity to prove that they have experience managing climate change projects and programs. The NDAs and focal points, as you've heard, they play an important role in a way to not only give guidance in terms of what are the strategic projects that a particular country may want to pursue, or that they may want to take forward to the GCF, but also they give a no objection letter to ensure that the projects and programs that are put forward by accredited entities are aligned with the climate change priorities and needs of that country. Next slide, please. Accredited entities, the rule to get accredited, it's basically to prove the capacity that an accredited entity may have in terms of project management. And as we said, in particular, it's in terms of the climate change projects and programs. But some of the things that the GCF look into is first to have experience managing projects, and those projects have to be according to a particular size. And when we're talking about the sizes, the different amounts of resources that the GCF manage. And as you can see, there's a figure there on the screen that shows you 4 categories of projects. Micro, that refer to projects between $1 or 0 to $10 million, small projects between $10 and $50 million, medium between 50 and 200 million, and large projects that are projects over $250 million. So entities that want to become accredited have to demonstrate that they have capacity managing projects of any of these sizes. So that will somehow determine the type of projects that you can later on manage with GCF resources. Just to give an example, in our case, we're accredited to only manage projects micro. It's also very important for an entity to have fiduciary standards in place. And here we're talking about basic and specialized fiduciary standards, and depending, of course, on the type of entity that you are, because as many of you may know, the GCF has this fit for purpose approach when it comes to accreditation, meaning that there's the same rules that not apply to everyone when it comes to accreditation. It's always about the type of entity that you are and the type of capacities that you have. And of course, there are certain elements as the ones that we're reviewing here that everyone might need to prove. However, not everyone has to have the same capacities when it comes to managing climate change projects. But when we speak about these fiduciary standards, we're talking about capacities to be able to demonstrate that you have mechanisms in place to monitor the projects that you're implemented in a transparent and accountable manner, that you have ways to report those projects, that you have audits in place, just to with the purpose of ensuring that the impact of the resources it's being monitored. You also have to demonstrate as an accredited entity that you're capable of managing different types of financial instruments. And as you may know as well, the GCF has different financial entities that they work with, for instance, grants, loans, equities, and guarantees. And based on the capacity of an entity, you need to show the track record of managing any of these financial instruments. And just to give you again another example, if you want to be able to request loans from the GCF, but all your track record has always shown that you've only managed grants, then perhaps the GCF may not give you accreditation conditions for you to manage loans. So that kind of information is very important. So basically, overall, the accreditation process, what it does is for you to review the capacities that your entity has in order to replicate those within the GCF structure. And another element that is, of course, important is to see how, what sort of capacities an entity may have when it comes to managing environmental and social risk. If you have certain sizes of project, and whether these environmental and social risks are either category A, B, or C, and also within the functions of intermediation, meaning involving and engaging with executing entities, you also have the capacities in place to monitor the possible negative, or hopefully not negative, impact that a project may have. And of course, there's other elements such as having a number of policies in place, but one particular example is having a gender policy, which is very important for the GCF and for the GCF mission. The next slide, please. Just to give you an overview of what's the situation right now with the GCF, I think to date, there's about 113 accredited entities. As you can see in the graph, the size and the type of entities, you see a bit of the distribution of what we have now, meaning that there are plenty of entities of different nature that engage with the GCF, both at the national, regional, and international level. There are accredited entities that can be direct and that are national or regional and international. In the case of Fundación Avina, for instance, we are a direct access entity, but we're a regional entity, meaning that we can provide support to many Latin American countries. And as I was mentioning, for accredited entities, it's very important to obtain the no objection letter from the NDAs when thinking of developing a project proposal, given that it's through this process that NDAs can ensure that a particular proposal is aligned to the climate change priorities and needs defined within a national process. So once you become accredited, that's when everything starts, meaning the process of developing a project proposal and the possibility, the real possibility of accessing GCF resources. So next slide, please. So now I'm giving you a bit more of our own example and our own experience and reflections when it comes to this process. Just for many of you who doesn't know us, Fundación Avina is a Latin American foundation with over 25 years of experience. We work promoting sustainable development through collaborative processes. Fundación Avina became accredited to the GCF in 2017. Our accreditation became effective, I would say, almost 1 year later due to legal procedures. And we are accredited as a regional direct access entity to manage projects and programs of up to $10 million, micro projects, grant-based only, meaning that we can receive grants from the GCF, but we can also give grants to beneficiaries within a project that we design. And the type of social environmental impact that we that we manage is those of category C, meaning projects with no environmental or social impact, and intermediation 3. In our accreditation experience is that it's been quite lengthy. It took us about 2 years to complete the process. And again, once we became accredited, we had to wait about 1 year to finalize the legal arrangements with the GCF. So before we were able to start designing projects. To date, Fundación Avina has implemented 4 readiness projects in Latin America. This was, you don't necessarily need to become an accredited entity to implement readiness projects. But when Fundación Avina started to engage with NDAs in Latin America, readiness projects became a need for those governments. Therefore, that's why we decided that it was strategic and it was responding to what NDAs at the time were requesting. So our first experience with the GCF was developing readiness projects. At this point, we're in the process of developing 2 adaptation to climate change projects, one in Brazil and another one in Mexico City. For both projects, we have requested resources from the project preparation facility for its technical design. This was particularly relevant for an entity like Fundación Avina, given that the collection of technical information that is locally relevant and important to not only to define the climate rationality of a project, but to make sure that your project is feasible and that will have all the elements to make it financeable by the GCF. It requires a lot of resources and a lot of time. Therefore, for us, was very important to ensure that we would have the resources in place to conduct the studies that are needed. And this is the reason why we went to the project preparation facility. And some of the examples of the type of technical information that is required when it comes to designing a project are conducting gender assessments, conducting stakeholder engagement processes, elaborating information on the economic and financial aspects of your proposal, having scientific information that can demonstrate climate change impacts within the territory in the course of, I don't know, 30 years of history. So you're able to elaborate a baseline and also being able to have future climate information through normally models that can give you an indication of how the climate change situation would look like in a particular region. That way you're able to plan having all this information. But again, as I've mentioned, it's not every entity has access to this information. In so many cases, this information is not available for the particular context. So it's crucial to think about those technical requirements and the financial implication that those requirements have when it comes to designing GCF projects and programs. So many accredited entities, especially direct access entities, do have this option of accessing project preparation facility, which of course is a great help, but at the same time, it may take some time to be able to receive these resources. Next slide, please. Overall, what I wanted to reflect, I think, as the last point, and I know that my time is also ending, is that right now we're in a process as an entity, not only in the process of completing our adaptation projects that we have in our portfolio, but at the same time, we're in the process of thinking about the reaccreditation process. Accredited entities at the GCF have to become reaccredited after 5 years. So when you do a balance between the type of activities that you do, the number of projects that you manage, and in that later on you have to become reaccredited again, and often it might require to elaborate again all the documents that were required at the time. You need to really think about and assess if going through the accreditation process it's something feasible. And I think it's not just because of what it takes when as an institution, but also to think about the impact that may have in the type of projects that you want to design. And just to give an example, what if you have a project that has an imminent need for a response? You know, you have a climate change impact and you need to bring a solution within the course of a year, but you know that designing it a GCF project might take you 2 or 3 years, then it's always to think about on whether this is the best option to move forward. So, and it's of course very difficult to say if this is going to be the case for every entity within the GCF, but I think this is a reflection that small entities accredited to the GCF, particularly direct access entities, may have, because we have, of course, limited capacities, we have limited resources, and often we have to be working on multiple projects at the same time with the same limited capacity. Therefore, I think the invitation is to always think about whether it's necessary to go through the accreditation process, because there's also other ways to engage with the GCF. There are, as I've mentioned, a number of accredited entities now that operate throughout the world, and it's often better to see collaboration process with those accredited entities, either to become an executor of a project, or otherwise to also help them design a project. So there are different ways in which organizations can engage besides the accreditation process. The other thing that is very important.
Andrea, could you please wrap up?
Thank you, Liane. Yeah, just very quickly. And I think, as you mentioned before as well, Liane, it's very important to say that any project that is going to go through the GCF has to have alignment with the climate change national framework. Therefore, any proposal that you may have should be reflecting and having conversations with the NDA and also with other climate change relevant stakeholders. So this was it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Andrea. Very important points that you made. Also relates back to some of the mentions that Erica made about upcoming issues. As an accreditation strategy is actually something that is one of the remaining policy gaps in the GCF, where issues like whether there are other ways of engagement with the GCF beyond accreditation, which is a big challenge for the many organizations that are still in the pipeline for the accreditation, is an issue. And then the second one that Andrea also highlighted quite well is that even if a direct access entity passes the hurdle of accreditation, and I want to point out that accreditation also has the plus side of obviously helping those organizations that engage in the process and upgrading and updating and improving their own policies and procedures. So it's not just negative, but even if you then succeed in the accreditation, that does not yet guarantee that you then have access to funding, which becomes quite clear when we are actually looking at the portfolio and who is accessing the portfolio of approved funding in the GCF, where we actually have funding flowing through direct access accredited entities only at about a fifth, and about 80% still going through international access entities. We are running short on time, but I wanted to at least take a couple of minutes to also look quickly again at the issue of GCF resources, the replenishment process and linkages to the international finance before we then have some questions. And I'm very happy to see that we already have received a number of questions. Just a couple of the points on the GCF resources, particularly, it's important to note that through the initial resource mobilization and the GCF1, the first replenishment phase, the GCF has received pledges altogether totaling 20.3 billion through those two phases. However, pledges does not mean financing is received. Over the past 7 years, the GCF has received so far 12.1 billion in finance and paid in finance, which is 8 billion from the initial resource mobilization and 4.1 billion from the GCF1, the first replenishment so far. And needless to point out that a lot of the pledges that were unfulfilled so far, particularly under the initial resource mobilization, is due to the fact that the United States has not fulfilled their initial 3 billion pledge. They only paid in 1 billion of the initial 3 billion pledge, and they have not contributed to GCF1. So it'll be very interesting to see to what extent and how they are engaging in the replenishment. It's also important to point out that for the GCF1, the first replenishment, which again is an ongoing replenishment, it started in January 2020 and lasts until the end of next year. We had 34 contributors, and those were mostly European states that pledged financing in euro. And while all that pledges have been confirmed, as I said, only 4.1 billion has been delivered so far. The schedule for those payments, and Erica has mentioned that already as well, can actually be drawn out as either cash or promissory notes over a time frame of up to 9 years. And that means that there is no really clear coordination, or it's not quite clear how much financing is available at any time, and there is quite a bit of fluctuation possible. And that was the reason, as Erica mentioned, that going into the current board meeting, the 33rd board meeting, we had a very low commitment authority, and that is basically the funding that the GCF has available to commit for approving projects, but also for making other commitments, like, for example, for administrative expenses or for readiness preparatory support or the project preparation facility that have been named as really important parts of programming by Andrea. And so a significant concern is actually that the GCF resources are subject to currency fluctuation and thus foreign currency loss. And this is a big problem. It was already a big problem in the initial resource mobilization. It continues to be a big problem under the GCF1, where most of the pledges have been made in euro. Actually, more than 98% of the pledges have been made in currency other than the US dollar, while the US dollar is the accounting currency of the GCF. And so we've already seen under GCF1 currency losses of 1.2 billion, which could increase as the euro weakens or the US dollar becomes stronger. And this is one of the reasons why at the board meeting that was just happening 2 weeks ago, there has been a revived discourse about currency hedging strategies and approaches. The Secretariat is working with the board, particularly the budget committee of the board, in reviewing a proposal that is going to be put forward at the next board meeting at B24. So as mentioned at B33, the process for the second replenishment was kicked off, as is supposed to be kicked off 18 months before the current replenishment phase of the first replenishment phase ends at the end of 2023. There are 4 replenishment meetings that are planned, an additional organizational meeting that will happen already in August. And as Erika has mentioned, it will be with the participation of the CSO and PSO private sector active observers. A first consultation meeting that is supposed to happen end of November this year, a second consultation meeting in April of next year, and then the pledging conference in September 2023. And again, the process, this negotiation process, which is open for board members and for all potential contributors, which will be mainly countries, but don't have to be exclusively countries, is going on in parallel, as is the update to the updated strategic plan with the submission process that was already mentioned, but also the second performance review of the GCF accomplishment during the ongoing GCF first replenishment phase through the independent evaluation unit, which has already submitted a summary, a preliminary summary assessment, but will be doing much more in-depth review ongoing. So how is that linked to the international climate finance overall? It has obviously to be seen in the context of the unfulfilled 100 billion per year pledge by 2020, which might, but might not be reached in 2023. And new OECD figures have actually indicated that in 2023, the finance provided and mobilized by developed countries for climate action in developing countries only reached $83 billion of this, while public finance, climate finance was the main part. Unfortunately, most of the provision of finance was in the form of loans, which accounted for 70%, with grants only for 26%. And this is also the reason why it's really, really, really important to look at the role of the GCF for that replenishment, because the GCF has an allocation framework with a balanced allocation mandate in grant equivalency terms for mitigation and adaptation, lifting up the overall underfinancing of adaptation that we have in the finance architecture, and also safeguarding and ring fencing financing for the LDCs, SIDS, and least developed countries. So the replenishment effort has to be seen in the need to make up for the shortcomings, the shortfalls of the 100 billion, but also in the view of unmet developing countries' need. And we had the need assessment report of the Standing Committee on Finance at the COP26, which indicated trillions are needed to fulfill the LDCs over the next, the NDCs over the next couple of years. And that's just for the ones that were costed, which was just a subset. And we also need to see that in the context of the discussions for the new collective quantified goal on climate finance that is ongoing in the UNFCCC, where we are actually looking of what financing goals we are to set beyond 2025, and thus in the second half of the GCF2 period. So while for GCF1, there have been some increases by some European countries, some of which have doubled their contribution versus the initial resource mobilization. Again, many have not. The overall list of contributors to GCF1 was lower than the initial resource mobilization period, which means that for GCF2, we not only need to push for those countries that have continued to contribute even more and do so in the form for grants, but to also bring in those countries like the US, like Australia, who have set out the last replenishment period. So that's maybe just a quick look at some of the issues related to resources replenishment and linkages to international climate finance. And with that, I would like to go to some of the questions that we have, because we only have about 15 minutes left. We have received a number of them. I will basically pull some of the first ones out. I have two that were addressed, I think, or could be answered by Erica. One is there a possibility of GCF funding loss and damage, and has that ever discussed? And the second one, and I think it has been partially answered by Andrea, but maybe Andrea or Erica might also come on that. That was on the issue of ability to help in project preparation. The questioner specifically was from Peru and was worried that there are no Peruvian approved projects due to deficiencies and actually financing being available. And maybe you can say something on that. And then I have some questions that have come in for Mirja. First of all, congratulations on the experience of the NDA. Some curiosity about how the Namibian NDA was willing, or what it took to nominate your organization to become a direct access entity, and basically how much pushing from the side of your organization was needed. And then also whether, Mirja, from your own experience on GCF policies and country ownership on public participation, you have some thoughts or recommendation of how one could improve the pressure on the national designated authority to work with CSOs specifically. So we'll do those, and hopefully we have a chance then to come in with some more questions.
Thanks. I'll jump in and start, I guess. So on the first question related to funding loss and damage, I think that's long been a question, and one of the big questions, especially as loss and damage finance has become even more prominent in the narrative, and is obviously something that many of us across civil society and indigenous peoples groups and others are pushing as we head into the upcoming COP at the end of this year in Egypt. So a couple of answers. One, the COP, so the Conference of the Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, has asked the GCF explicitly. So the COP gives guidance to the GCF, and one of the things it mentioned, I think now maybe 2 years ago, was for more information or exploring how the GCF could or was financing loss and damage. And so the GCF has reported on this somewhat and includes it in some of its reports to the COP, amongst other things, and has tried in different ways to discuss how some of its funding could be or is related to loss and damage, including, talking about things like early warning systems or other projects that the GCF is involved in. It doesn't explicitly have at this moment a mandate to fund loss and damage. And if you look at what it's mandated through its governing instrument, it's to fund adaptation and mitigation and to have a 50-50 balance of those two. And so if you were to add in loss and damage, which has been, I think, discussed somewhat, especially as the issues about finance of loss and damage finance have come up more and more, and like whether that would be a separate loss and damage finance facility or where that financing would come from, is concern that the GCF funding loss and damage, one, that it would take away from its adaptation finance, or it would just sort of reclassify adaptation as loss and damage, which I think is something that, we want to avoid, because loss and damage and adaptation are two distinct things. But, and also that, as I think Andrea mentioned, it can sometimes take a long time for a GCF project to come to fruition or for entities to be accredited, but also for projects to come to fruition. And loss and damage finance often needs to move quicker than that. And so the answer is yes. They have discussed loss and damage finance and it potentially being a possibility. And they have reported on ways that they're trying to address it, or creative ways that they might be addressing it or preventing loss and damage through things like the development of early warning systems in countries, which is more about sort of prevention of loss and damage than addressing it. But it hasn't yet figured out exactly how it might do that. I think, going forward, there may be more of these conversations, depending on where the conversations around loss and damage finance go, and whether the GCF is the right place for that. Though it may end up being that what they would have to create is a specific window for loss and damage, or something to make sure that it wasn't taking away from what the GCF is doing, has already done, and is doing related to adaptation in particular. So hopefully that answers the question on loss and damage. And then just quickly, I can do my best, but I think Andrea has answered this somewhat, about development and strengthening of capacities to prepare projects to come to the Green Climate Fund. So I think that the main answers there are that the GCF does have pools of money for readiness support and in its project preparation facility that are there for entities to use to help develop their capacities. And I think Andrea touched on these a bit, and maybe she or Mirja would like to touch on them a bit more. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, let me just come in quickly, because the question was specific also to the Peruvian experience. I just want to point out that the very first project that was approved by the GCF, so FP001, was a project in Peru. And then it's also important to point out that we have many either regional, multi-country, or even global programs where Peru or any other country might be a potential recipient of finance, even if it's not solely for a country. So I mean, looking at actually how much money is a country is receiving under the GCF by just looking at a single country project is a little bit deceptive, because there are quite a number, and actually the number is increasing, of financing facilities, fund of fund and other approaches, where a multitude of potential recipient countries are mentioned, with the big caveat that we usually at the beginning don't have any, when it's approved, have no transparency of how much money under that program will flow to which individual countries. But maybe, Mirja, if you can come in on the questions that were related to how you got the NDA to be on your side and be your champion, and also on how we can, what your recommendation would be to improving pressure on NDAs for working more with local observers and civil society specifically. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So the first question on how did we get nominated without engagement? Namibia is the second least populated country. So the ministry just basically looked at what institutions might have the track record to potentially be accredited. And I think Andrea presented it in quite a bit of detail. The accreditation process is not an easy process, especially for CSOs and especially for smaller organizations. So the way our NDA went about it, they nominated 8 entities, 7 of which were were national banks or regional banks, or no, national banks. And then us, simply because you need to provide quite a bit of evidence and show a good track record in managing projects and being able to adhere to specific financial criteria. But even in our case, sort of the GCF criteria by far exceed any other donor funding that we receive. So it is quite a strict process, and it, as a result, just not many entities were capable of potentially shouldering the accreditation. And that's where we got in. So they just basically identified who could possibly make it. And so far only the EIF did from the 8 institutions. So even the banks struggle with the policy requirements that you need to fulfill. On sort of the question of how useful are policies on country ownership and public participation to demand more inclusion, I think there are multiple levels. So from our side, in terms of CSO demanding more inclusion, we didn't have to demand that much. It was a lot more, it was a very diplomatic process and a lot more showing them sort of the value added of having CSOs on board and being able to provide sort of the technical expertise. And then a big component was, of course, also this whole part of making CSOs more approachable and just organizing better, especially if you have multiple CSOs or multiple strong CSOs working on very specific areas, which is the case for us. So in our case, since the NDA and most accredited entities are very aware of the policies and sort of the guidance from the GCF side, they are very receptive if you go to them and be like, we want to be more involved and we have some things that we can offer to help you. Of course, that would also mean that CSOs need to actually engage in these processes and be aware of these policies and guidances that are out there. I think there's actually another level that I think is more important. And we recently had a discussion with our NDA on multi-country projects. And I think Saeed also asked a similar question. Who basically said, well, a no objection letter doesn't guarantee a good project. And that's exactly what came from our NDA. In many cases, they were not consulted. They were presented a final project proposal. They were requested to sign a letter. And in many cases, that came with a lot of pressure. And I think until the GCF doesn't make these kind of consultative processes with a range of stakeholders mandatory and just promotes them and has them as guidance, I think I'm not sure to what extent the NDA or even the accredited entities, well, at least not the direct, will be in a position to really push this forward. Well,
thank you,
it's not from the
Mirja.
NDA side.
Sorry for cutting you short. I just wanted to give Andrea also a chance to respond, albeit briefly, because we are running out of time, to some questions that have come up, which I think are very related. So we had one question that actually goes to the fact that it's very complicated to present a project but also particularly for some of small organizations that have no accreditation, with that related to the question whether and maybe the responsibility of organizations like Fundación Avina and others that are accredited, what they could do to receive ideas for funding proposals or for collaboration from smaller organizations that are not directly accredited. And that's also related to one, and I know, Andrea, you have experience in your own project that you are preparing on what could be done, particularly to help Indigenous peoples access the Green Climate Fund. So maybe if you could answer those, or try to answer, knowing full well that it's hard to get a comprehensive answer to those very complex questions. And then unfortunately, we have to wrap up.
Thank you, Liana, and thank you everyone for the questions. Yeah, absolutely. It is very challenging accessing resources. However, there's always windows of opportunities, I would say. The first one is to say that Fundación Avina is open and welcoming to receiving any proposals that you may have. I mean, of course, there is a process and there's so many elements that need to be discussed, but feel free to contact me and, see what we can do about it. I mean, we like to collaborate, and that's in our DNA. So please do so. In terms of the challenges, or the difficulties that we've all heard and we continue hearing within the GCF, what I would say is that there are different ways to engage to break the barriers related to limited capacity building or lack of funding. And one is the best way to engage is either finding and collaborating with existing accredited entities to see how you can create or join their project portfolios. I mean, depending on the type of entity, in some cases, it will be easier. In others, it will be impossible. You never know, but I think that's a good option. The other option is to engage with the NDAs, particularly in the process of GCF country program, in the development of the country program strategy, because the GCF more and more wants to fund only projects that are included within the country entity, the country program. So if there is an idea there, even though it may not have an accredited entity, it's an opportunity for later on request readiness related resources, or even for the NDA to identify those projects that are difficult and that may have technical needs and that may require PPF resources later on. So it's a good way to start thinking on where are the needs, or what are the needs for a particular countries, and what are the who are the key stakeholders that need to engage with. And lastly, the other thing I wanted to say is that once the readiness needs are reflected either within that process or even in conversations between the NDA stakeholders and the GCF Secretariat, readiness process, one of the main outputs of the readiness process are concept note development. So you develop concept notes. That's what the GCF wants you to do. So it's a great opportunity to start moving from capacity building needs towards concrete project ideas. Of course, once you develop a concept note, another process starts of having finance to collect technical information and so on. But at least it's a good way to start thinking on transforming all those needs, climate change needs, into concrete ideas, and start identifying accredited entities that can help you later on turning those ideas into potential project proposals. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I just wanted to pull up one question that was asked, which I think is, and then we close, which was pointing out that the GCF is obviously engaging with a number of countries in which human rights and civil society participation is very challenging. The example of Nicaragua was giving, but also Myanmar and other countries. And some of them do have projects with the GCF. And so the question related, or the concern related with that question was exactly that kind of engagement, that kind of engagement is happening. So maybe for some, and Erica, maybe you can come in on that particularly. While the GCS obviously, or the eligibility for receiving funding from the GCF is governed by being a developing country under the UNFCCC, so it's hard to quote unquote deny funding under the GCF. There are a couple of guardrails that can happen through the engagement with accredited entities, and we do actually have a current example of how some of the accountability mechanisms can help in keeping potential human rights abuses in check. And maybe you can refer to that really quickly. And then I apologize, it has to be really quick because then we have to wrap up.
Sure, just very quickly on that question. I mean, one, we have seen in some instances that the GCF has stopped some of its activities in countries or where a country has pulled out. So there was at least one example where Myanmar was one of the countries that was going to be part of a larger program, and before the project was approved, it took Myanmar out, and I believe the GCF has stopped some of its funding of activities there because of the ongoing situation. And the other thing I will say is that obviously this is not a problem that is unique to just the GCF, and while they're in place, policies and things that are supposed to promote or require this consultation, we do know that if there's not a freedom to consult on projects, that's not happening, and that can't happen. So one thing that the GCF does have in place, and that I think has been discussed on this webinar series before and others, is that the GCF has a number of independent units. So it has both an independent integrity unit that deals with integrity issues, but it such as anti-money laundering, etc., as well as it has an independent redress mechanism that is available to local communities, to Indigenous peoples, to people who think that they have been or that they will be harmed by a GCF activity or a potential GCF activity. So actually complaints can be brought before a project is approved, and that includes, and part of that harm can be a lack of consultation or a lack of being able to participate and not having those rights upheld or those procedures upheld. And so you can file a complaint either once a project is approved, but also while it's being considered by the GCF. And I will say one of the things that can happen that is important for people, especially where there are lack of freedoms, are that these complaints can be filed anonymously or confidentially, not anonymously, confidentially, so that the GCF and the accredited entity won't necessarily know who has brought the complaint, which is something that the GCF's accountability mechanism, but accountability mechanisms at all of the major institutions, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, have long put in place as recognition as one of the important ways to protect environment and human rights defenders from being retaliated against and from facing retaliation due to complaining or being in opposition to a project. And so it is by no means a perfect system, and obviously there are a lot of challenges in many places, but that is one place that people can go to and can use, and the IRM has a number of cases, including one from Nicaragua that's been filed related to one of the projects there, that is currently under investigation. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Great, thank you very much. And that is actually a great segue for us to close out, because I want to point out that we have a fourth and last planned webinar in that series that will actually look in a little bit more detail on some of the safeguards and broader frameworks and broader concerns that have raised with that last question related to civil society participation, human rights, when we look in more detail at the Indigenous Peoples Policy, the gender policy, and also the environmental and social management framework and system of the Green Climate Fund. And again, be on the lookout for announcement for that last upcoming webinar, which is tentatively scheduled for September 6th, but more information will be forthcoming. With that, I want to thank our great panelists, Erika, Andrea, and Mirja. Thank you all for staying on 10 minutes longer. Apologies for going over time. As you can see, there is always a lot to discuss about the GCF, and we have only scratched the surface on a number of those issues. So thanks again for engaging with us, and looking forward to having you participate also in the next one. And I want to close out by thanking particularly also our great interpreters. I fear that some of us might in between have spoken way too fast for them to follow along, but appreciate their effort and their non-complaint. Thanks again for everybody. And just to let folks know that the recording will be made available, I believe, within a couple of days. So also look for notification for that. With that, thank you so much for joining us today. Good evening, good night, and what remains of this morning. Bye-bye.